members of our Pacific family who join us today. So welcome to the Pacific Ocean and Climate Crisis Assessment webinar. I am very happy to see that we have a lot of people with us today. Yeah, I am Billy. I'll be your moderator for this webinar. And for your information, this is the 11th webinar for the Pacific Resilience Partnership, but the first one for 2022. And you might have noticed in the flyer that was circulated that we are looking at discussing and highlighting the value of research in informing decision-making for building resilience. And we are also introducing the Pacific Ocean and Climate Crisis Assessment to the members of the Pacific Resilience Partnership and all the participants who are here with us today. And then we also use this webinar to discuss the role of academia in supporting the Pacific Resilience Partnership, and also how academia and the Pacific Resilience Partnership could support the Pacific Ocean and Climate Crisis Assessment, and how the Pacific Ocean Climate Crisis Assessment provided evidence and provide the information needed for decision making at the community, national, regional, and even the global level. So I do not want to take much of your time with this introduction. I just want to briefly say that we have four distinguished panelists for our webinar today. And I'm going to introduce the panelists briefly, and then we will give the panelists 5 to 7 minutes to speak. And then we will have a question and answer session at the end. But if you have a comment or a question, you can put during the presentations, you can put them on the chat. The Pacific Island Forum Secretariat team is monitoring the chat, and they will bring those questions together. So our first panelist today, we have distinguished Professor Stephen Rotuva, who is the director of Macmillan Brown Center for Pacific Studies, the University of Canterbury, who is a co-lead for the POCCA assessment. And then we also have Professor Bronwyn Hayward from the University of Canterbury as well, who is a member of the steering committee for the POCCA. And then we have Professor Elizabeth Holland, the director for Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development at the University of South Pacific, who is also the co-lead for POCCA. And then we have Associate Professor Joeli Veteyaki from the University of South Pacific, who is also a member of the steering committee for the POCCA. So those are our four panelists for us today. And I think we will start now with distinguished Professor Stephen Rotuva, who will provide an explanation about the value of research in the building resilience and how the Pacific Ocean and Climate Crisis Assessment will contribute to research generally. So over to you, distinguished Professor.
Well, thanks for us, Billy. This is Sambula Vinaka. Pacific greetings to all of you. It's nice weather here in Christchurch. I'm looking outside and I see a lot of birds. They're very happy, like the people here. Summer is still here and winter is still a distance away. And thank you so much for the opportunity for being here. We're given 5 to 7 minutes each, I think 6 to 7 minutes each. It's not much, so I'll try to be as brief as I can to give my colleagues the opportunities as well. So I've been asked to basically provide a general overview of the relationship between research and this particular project in relation to climate crisis in the Pacific. and how can we link that to the work of PRP. Thank you so much, PRP, for for the opportunity to be able to have this discussion, which is very, very significant now, especially the issue of climate crisis is very, very significant in the region. Our leaders in the bold declaration have recognized the fact that it is perhaps one of the biggest, or if not the biggest, security challenge which our region is living with. So like COVID, we've come to learn to live with it. And how do we adapt? How do we engage? And how do we mitigate against the negative consequences of the climate crisis we're living through? Now, there are a number of reasons, of course, for a team coming together. The POCCA, as really has mentioned, it's funded by the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and we've been working together on the project for a year or so, and we have 3 years altogether before the completion of the project. And of course, as a result of COVID-19, things might change a bit in terms of timing. There's of course a need for evidence-based approach when it comes to policies and strategies and legislations in the region in relation to the climate crisis. And it's often said that in the Pacific, we don't have the capacity to be able to do research of this magnitude. Unfortunately, that's not very true. In fact, I think the problem is to do with how we're able to harness our capacity, harness our intellectual and technological resources effectively as a way of doing research which are able to inform our policymakers, our governments, our regional organizations, our institutions, our civil society and communities as to things which are happening within the region in the context of the climate crisis. So, and also a lot of research in the past on the climate crisis in the Pacific. I'm using the word climate crisis because that's the term being used nowadays. The word climate change tends to be too broad and too routinized, that it kind of does not really capture what's happening in the world today, particularly in the Pacific, in relation to the calamity of the climate crisis. So the one of the I was trying to get back to where I was. Most of the research done on the Pacific has been externally driven by external expertise, and I think it's time that we've been discussing this in our team, which is very much Pacific-led. That Pacific researchers and Pacific scholars using the intellectual, the scientific resources that we have to lead such research as a way of making sure that there's a sense of connection with belonging, connection with place, and connection with relevance as well, in terms of how we capture the voices of the people in the Pacific. Certainly nowadays it's very important that the Pacific voices needs to be given more firepower, as it were, in various global climate forums, such as the IPCC, for instance. There have been 2 of our team members are members of the IPCC, Professor Elizabeth Holland and Professor Bronwyn Hayward. And Bronwyn is very deeply engrossed at the moment with doing the final draft of the next IPCC report. So one of the significant weaknesses has to do with the voices from the global south. Often is driven by the global north science research and science voices. So this is an opportunity for us to be able to provide more voices for our global south, particularly from those of us in the Pacific. And also there's a kind of lack of interdisciplinary research on the climate crisis. A lot of the research done in this area have been rather piecemeal, scientific research here and there, and a bit of economic research here and there, and a bit of research on issues such as mitigation and loss and damage here and there. What we're trying to do is to bring all these things together in an interdisciplinary way. So we have a team which ranges from the natural scientists on one hand, and then social scientists and also experts on indigenous knowledge, on traditional knowledge. So it's wide-ranging in terms, because climate itself is not just environmental as traditionally assumed. It is, of course, environmental, it is economic, it is cultural, it is political, and it is to do with health, it is to do with technology. It's very much to do with, in the Pacific, people's survival. It has to do with migration, people's mobility, and has to do with land, has to do with identity. So all these things together need to be looked at seriously with the lenses of science, of social science, and of course of indigenous knowledge as well. So it's a great opportunity for all these different approaches to work together collaboratively. Often you don't see that happening in research. Often science tends to look down either on social science on traditional knowledge and vice versa. So the team has been able through the process to bring all this together. And also there's a lack of reliable data on community resilience. There's so much happening in communities. There's so much happening in terms of resilience. Resilience in terms of not only the way people have changed perceptions to what's happening, but also in terms of infrastructure, in terms of methods of planting, in terms of methods of building houses, a whole lot of things which have been, we want to kind of do more research on that. And we're covering about 16 countries in the region, which is really the entire Pacific. And last but not least, the idea is to kind of deepen the collaboration, deepen the partnership between research and governments and regional organizations, civil society organizations. And PRP, I know, is a great forum where this happens, where all these groups are being represented together, and which is a great thing to do, given the fact that the Pacific is diverse in terms of the not only the scattered islands or the big ocean states, not the small island states, the big ocean states, but also differences in the level of economic development, political systems and cultures and so forth. So that collaboration is very, very important. And of course, a kind of research that we do will fit in well with what PRP is doing in terms of bringing all these stakeholders together across the different disciplines, across the different areas of our lives, whether it's to do with health, to do with environment, to do with politics, to do with culture. And so a lot of our work can also fit into the PRP work. A lot of our work can also engage with regional organizations, as well as governments, civil society organizations, and vice versa. We're also looking for advice and, of course, for knowledge which is coming out of the region. There's so much happening in the region. There's so much in terms of knowledge construction, creation, in terms of strategies, in terms of policies. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to begin to work together and see the region in one template and with one voice. Thank you so much. I'll finish there. Of course, my colleagues will continue from there. And we'll have time for questions later. Back to you, Willie.
Thank you very much, Vinavalevo, distinguished Professor Ratuva. You have laid down excellent platform and provide the rationale for the POCCA, and it's also good that you link a little bit to the IPCC, because the next speaker is Professor Bronwyn Hayward. Well, thank you, Professor Hayward, for joining us after many sleepless nights trying to finalize the IPCC report. But we really need your thoughts and your views of the linkages between the IPCC and the POCCA assessments going forth. Over to you, Professor Hayward. Thank you.
Bula Vanaka, Maloa Kia ora. Thank you very much for involving me and inviting me today. As has been said, we're deep in the process of approving Working Group 2's report for the IPCC. We hope that that will be released on the 28th of February, It's part of the IPCC's 6th assessment round. So most people here will know, but just to recap, there are 3 working groups at the moment, and hundreds of scientists, and a synthesis report and 3 special reports that we've been working on. So the first one that recently came out was the physical science report. The one that we hope to bring out on the 28th of February is the impacts, adaptation and vulnerability report. And that will be closely followed by the mitigation report and then a synthesis report that I also serve on. Alongside these, there have been 3 special reports in the last 6 years. One was the 1.5 special report, which small island states played such a key role in enabling to happen, and it was an honour to serve on that. The Climate and Land Report and the Oceans and Cryosphere or Frozen Water Report. Now, unfortunately, there's very little I can say at the moment specifically about the climate change adaptation and impacts and vulnerability, because we're in the middle of the very intense line-by-line government approval. It's because of Omicron we're later, and it's very long hours, as many people here will know. It's in a different time period, being hosted in Europe, so mostly we're up at night. I'd really like to thank and acknowledge the huge work of the co-leads of the Small Island States chapter, Professor Michelle McCoo from Trinidad and Tobago, and Professor Morgan Waira, who have been doing an amazing job. The topics that are covered in this report to look out for and how it affects both our work and the wider work of the region is it begins with looking at the Paris Agreement, the global stocktake, and here organisations like our research group can contribute when this is published to, as Professor Ratuva says, filling in the gaps of what's missing from the IPCC reports. At the moment, what is covered by topic is looking at the sectoral and regional risks to nature and humans systems, and that includes risks to culture, risks to values, identity, and livelihoods. Also looking and rethinking about what climate risks mean in terms of hazard exposure in its widest sense. Thinking about the social and economic effects of irreversible loss, economic and non-economic loss. Then looking also at the limits of adaptation and what conditions can enable communities to adapt. There's a discussion about co-benefits of trade-offs and opportunities to support the Sustainable Development Goals and opportunities to support climate resilient development, considering also the strengths and the limits of that opportunity. The specific chapter, of course, that will be of interest to all of us here is chapter 15, the small islands. But I will just note some other important chapters that are coming out. Chapter 3 will look at oceans and coastal ecosystems. Chapter 6, which I'm directly involved in, looks at cities, and there is a special paper on cities by the sea, on the impact of sea level rise and issues on coastal infrastructure and communities. Then chapter 7 looks at health and well-being, and that covers the issues of displacement, migration, projected changes, and the impact of trapped populations unable to move. And chapter 8 will cover poverty and livelihood impacts. So probably one of the new also important features of this report, as well as you'll have seen the public debate around loss and damage, but there's also the emphasis on what does climate resilient development really look like, and what's the role of grey literature and being able to document and bring in Indigenous knowledge and new knowledge. So I see the partnership that USP and the University of Canterbury have cemented as really important as a way in which we can support the scholarship that's coming out of small island states, which is tremendous, and to feature it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Hayward, for providing that appetizer of the upcoming IPCC report, and it's exciting. It sounds very exciting, and looking forward to the information there, and I think it's important as well to think of the linkages of that and what's missing there, as mentioned by Professor Ratuva. And I think our third panelist, Associate Professor Joeli Veteyaki, will bring some perspectives on why do we need to include indigenous knowledge into the Pacific Ocean and climate crisis assessments. And I think that is crucial for us to think about. Over to you, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lau, and greetings from Suva to you all across the Pacific and beyond. I acknowledge the opportunity available through this this webinar to share a little bit more on the challenges that we have to ensure that we have climate resilience communities in the Pacific, and also support appropriate adaptation that is both meaningful and relevant to our people, as well as to the new knowledge that is now part of life in the Pacific. And with that, I'd like to make the point that any form of intervention to either enhance or strengthen resilience and to explore new adaptive measures that should be taken as we continue to battle climate change, we need to start with our people. And in the Pacific, I think it is important to note that in a lot of our countries, we have indigenous communities that actually dominate. So it is, I think, smart to ensure that we start whatever the intervention that we want to bring in to address global issues such as climate change with indigenous communities. And thankfully for us, our indigenous communities in a lot of ways still have some of their good practices that I think are very relevant for us moving forward with the kind of challenges that we now have to address. Indigenous communities, whether they are from the Pacific or elsewhere, they have lived in this or in their countries the longest, and therefore have in-depth knowledge of their environment and of the system that works perhaps much better than most. So it is important to avoid starting from scratch. We need to start with our indigenous communities and then try and see how we can enhance what needs to be resurrected and continued for the future, given the changing conditions that exist in societies, and also bring in the new science that Professor Bronwyn and Professor Ratuva had alluded to. So this is, I think, an important point that we must continue to push for, that our people have got some knowledge, some practices that can still be relevant and be used under the current conditions that we live in, where things obviously have changed in terms of society, in terms of economic development, and of course in relation to the climate that is now becoming a major source of threat for a lot of us. You know, the other thing about our indigenous knowledge is that it is time tested. It has been used. And I will try and very briefly go through some of the areas where this body of knowledge should not be ignored as we move forward to try and address the challenges, including those brought around by climate change. Some of the traditional indigenous knowledge that we have, well, in fact, they are part of the society. We have social and cultural systems. The way Pacific Islanders behave is a reflection of that cultural system that they have. There is respect for the elders, because the elders are supposed to be the keepers of knowledge. They've lived their longest and therefore have acquired that very distinct qualification. We have building structures. I've just spent 2 years living in Samoa, and given the kind of heat that is there, I now understood better why they have to have fales. The Mbures in places where they are, in Vanuatu and in Fiji, they are much cooler during hot season and are much warmer during the cold season. These are things, these are technologies and body of knowledge that people have accumulated over centuries of living under Pacific Island conditions. Then we have the farming system. Dr. Lau and I have been fortunate to be part of a little project that we have submitted an application for a new approach, which is called conservation agriculture and sustainable intensification, which basically tries to or recognizes the good practices from the traditional system, and then tries to integrate, incorporate the best science to allow us to better manage the soil, to improve on the crop rotation that would allow us to have intensified output from our farms. And then, of course, we have the fishing system, the system that has allowed our people to live with the resources that they have over the centuries that they have lived here. I'm currently conducting some training for fisheries officers here in Fiji, because Fiji is now working on its international commitment to designate 30% of its EEZ as an MPA. And we are borrowing that whole concept of MPA again from the traditional practices. So that basically is my point. That's the reason why, as we move forward, my plea is that we engage in a very meaningful and inclusive way traditional knowledge. And I think that, combined with the best of science that is now available, we have a better chance of living with the ravages of climate change. Thank you very much, Lau.
Professor Veteyaki, wonderful intervention, and I'm very happy that you have touched the connection and the connectivity of the system, the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous people, and the connectedness, the land, the sea, the air, and part of the social and cultural system. And thank you very much for bringing those excellent examples to demonstrate the relevance of traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge in building resilience. And our final speaker for today, we have Professor Elizabeth Holland from the University of South Pacific, who will provide insights on bringing the interdisciplinary angle and the science of ocean and the climate into the assessment, and working together with the indigenous and traditional knowledge that we talked about earlier. Now over to you, Professor Holland.
Nakalauvili, It's such an honor to be here with the PRP and as a member of this team of panelists. Distinguished Professor Ratuva is, one of a kind. And so, and Bronwyn Hayward has come from her sleepless nights to join us. And Lau Vili is in Pacific Harbor talking about climate change, food security, and health. And our esteemed Joelle Vietiaki, he's always filled with insights and bringing us back to what's really important, the community, the sea, and where we really need to begin. And the idea for this Pacific Climate and Ocean Assessment is also inspired by the leadership of our Pacific leaders, because time and time again, they've led in diplomacy, they've led in the UNFCCC, they ensured that there were key elements of the Paris Agreement that were there for the long haul. They ensured that traditional knowledge was in the Paris Agreement. They ensured that the ocean was in the Paris Agreement, that loss and damage was there, that it was legally binding, that there was a 5-year review. And Tuvalu's leadership in 2009 in the Copenhagen negotiations ensured that 1.5 degrees actually was on the radar. We saw that reiterated in Paris with Solomon Islands leadership for the LDCs on 1.5. We saw it with the ambition that was led by the Marshall Islands on ensuring that we got higher ambition to meet a 1.5 goal. And by the time we got to Glasgow last year, 1.5 was in everyone's mouth. That didn't happen except for the voices and the diplomacy of the Pacific. So it seems only appropriate that we rise to the challenge as academics, as researchers, as a collective, to make sure that the incredible research that we're doing here in the Pacific is reflected and provides context for our experience and for the interpretation of the IPCC. We know that the US is running a climate assessment in parallel that's mandated by Congress. So there's Hawaii and small islands emphasis from the from the US climate assessment. But what we're hoping for here is really a more holistic look, bringing in the traditional, the indigenous, the local knowledge, the depth, the generations that it spans, to provide the context, to provide a stronger foundation for the leadership of our Pacific diplomats. And we'd like to make sure that we invite each and every one of you that has contributed your own type of leadership to join us in collectively writing this assessment. Because if this assessment comes from a small group of people that protect that sort of knowledge in just the way that we see it, and the current drafts of the outline that we have are informed by the way that we see things. But many of you, as I've seen the list, are also researchers in your own right and have more to contribute. There's an incredible amount of gray literature out there that we find very difficult to cite in the IPCC. But that represents knowledge that we need some mechanism to help provide the voice for the Pacific in our fight for this climate crisis, for the climate emergency that we're currently experiencing, and that I'm afraid will only get worse based on the output of the Working Group 1 report, when we're looking at more than 7 or 10 or even tens of meters of sea level rise by 2300. So it's with that I'd like to close as a panelist. Oh, but there is one more thing. as we approach the global, I've spent the last 2 weeks, I think, in meetings with the crop agencies, with the UK, most recently with the Committee on the Status of Women. And what I'm hearing from all of these discussions in terms of what do we need? What do they need as negotiators in going to approach the global stocktake that's starting this year? So what I'm hearing, and I'd like to hear any feedback on this, is reiteration of Marshall Islands and call for increased ambition for reducing emissions. That's reiterated by every Pacific country. To meet the 1.5 target that was first posed in 2009 by Tuvalu. The role of the oceans in the UNFCCC, as was so beautifully reflected in Joelle's comments just now, that we need to include consideration of the ocean, of the heat, the carbon dioxide uptake by the ocean that's resulting in ocean acidification. That the role of environmental integrity and stewardship, ecosystem accounting, these nature-based solutions, markets, and biodiversity are important and need to be further supported by the research. That there's an increasing call for a global goal on adaptation to rebalance the climate finance investments, but also to make sure that the climate finance gets back to the ground that Joelle so underlined and underscored. That we need accelerated and deeper consideration of loss and damage within the negotiations and within the global stocktake. We need to ensure that transparency is upfront and center, because there's a tendency in various emissions things to sort of hide a little bit here, so that maybe someone can get away with emissions, but they don't have to report them. So we need that sort of transparency. And to ensure that the resources are in place for the PRP, that we need to ensure that there's climate financing, again, with a rebalancing of the investment. So it's not just mitigation focused or focused on needs of other countries, that it's focused on the needs of the Pacific. Human and environmental security, human rights, climate justice, and mobility. And at the International Court of Justice, Vanuatu has done some tremendous work in highlighting the importance of environmental security. So those are areas that we see that research is needed to really support this climate and ocean assessment and to lay the foundation, because we don't want this to be the last one. We want this to be a beginning of our leadership in research for our very futures.
Thank you very much, Professor Holland. I think that's an excellent way to anchor our presentation today, as you brought back the leadership of the Pacific and how it all evolves, the discussion. And also the call for the participants to join and also contribute. I think that is very, very valuable. And also thank you for providing those key points for the stocktake, those key points, and how the assessment and the Pacific researchers could contribute to that, to the UNFCCC and the IPCC, and also in building the resilience and the PRP. All right, so now I have seen on the chat, there's very good discussion on the resilience Fale that's brought up. There's also a very good testimony or some comments there on localization of research and the Pacific, the value of Pacific-led research. So I am now going to open the floor for question. We need the first 2 questions. Just use the KISS principle. Keep it simple, sweetheart. So we will do that, and then we'll give the panels time to respond. Make it also very short and sharp. And then after that, we'll give 1 minute to probably a member of MFATS who's here, just to comment on the POCCA. And we will keep 1 minute to the key representative of academia to the Pacific Resilience Partnership, Associate Professor Chimay Malako from FNU, from the Fiji National University. But for now, open the floor for two questions. So please raise your hand. I see that there is a discussion already going on the chat, but if you want to voice your question from the chats, so please do so.
Dr. Viliamu, there's a question from Michael T. Roman, and it says, aside from passively observing talanoas and reading, how can social scientists outside of the region, equipped with decades of time in the region, help?
Okay, thank you very much for that, Tia, and thanks, Michael, for bringing that question. So we locked that question down. And then the second question I see here from Rose Martin: how do you work with traditional ecological knowledge, which culturally is not intended for open access outside the community? So this is the secrecy element of traditional knowledge. So that's our second question. I think we'll give one more question, and then we'll open to our okay, so we have a comment here from Laitia Tamata, and then there is criticism that indigenous knowledge may not develop fast enough to appreciate the fast-paced climate change or climate crisis is happening. But thank you, Professor Joeli, for that criticism. May be acceptable if indigenous knowledge is based on facts. So that's good. I think there is a question from Susanna. 30% of the EZ being put aside as marine protected areas. Is there a system in place to assess the marine species in the areas being designated as part of the MBAs to also promote conservation or particular marine species that has dwindling numbers? So now, panelists, quick responses to those three questions. One from Michael, and then the comments from Tamata, and the question from Susanna, and also Rose, the other question from Rose. Over to you, panelists. You have 1 minute each.
Oh, sorry, Chair, can I respond to the first one, please?
Yep, go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, that's a very good question. What can outside social scientists and so forth, how can they connect with those in the region? Yeah, certainly that's a question that's been around for some time. Certainly collaboration is one of the ways in which that can be done in terms of, because there's a research space over the years have been very highly politicized in terms of who should be there and who should not be there, because of the history of the way in which a lot of the local knowledge have been biopirated. That's a term which has been used over the years, and the unethical nature of some of the external researchers in terms of extraction and predatory knowledge consumption and commodification over the years. I've written quite significantly on this. So collaboration is very, very important in terms of how we can work together in terms of those who in the region, those who know the local circumstances, the local cultures, as well as the those from outside and how they can work together. And certainly pulling together a lot of those are very, very significant. Certainly in New Zealand, there's a lot of move in that direction where research in the Maori space, there are a lot of ethical and protocols, ethical issues protocols which have to be looked at. Certainly in the Pacific, we've had tourism research in the Pacific where people come in without any research permits, and they basically steal things and then off they go. I know of some of them anyway over the years. So those things are very ethical questions of research. One of the reasons why those externally, a lot of places in the world, they do that as well, in Europe and so forth. So it's a matter of working together, making sure that the processes, the protocols, the ethics are properly managed. Because knowledge is contextualized in cultures. It's not something floating there like cloud, which can be grabbed, the Australis kind of idea. So, and secondly, to do with traditional knowledge, second question, and which are supposed to be sacred and sacred. Certainly that's where that's an area where the conversation has to start between the owners of knowledge and researchers, rather than us coming in to take it away. If it's felt that it's within the interests of the community, it's something sacred, something for thousands of years been part of their identity, part of their cosmology, it's important that that should be recognized. And it's up to them whether they want to share it or not. Yeah, very briefly for response to those two questions.
Thank you, Professor Ratuva. Joeli, you want to address the fisheries one, the marine protected areas one?
Certainly, there's a process underway with Fiji planning for the 30% closure of 30% EEZ area closure for their MPA, which was a commitment made to SIDS in 2005. So thankfully, my information is that there is some partnership already underway with those that are knowledgeable in useful new skills like marine spatial planning. So basically all of the layers of different information is being put together to try and identify the most likely, or the potential sites. Of course, at the end of the day, the scientists will then offer the options to the decision makers, and that will take its own course from there on. But there is a process underway. I also would like to just spend a minute on the comment by Mr. Tamata that traditional knowledge is not keeping pace with the changes. It's interesting because in a lot of ways, and we just saw from Mohammed commenting on the kind of buildings, that skill is from the traditional past, and it seems to be very useful even today. And I always remember two examples. One was from the late Robert Johannes. He said that scientists should never start from scratch when trying to learn about biodiversity. That knowledge is already there with the customary or the indigenous communities. They should go start from there and then carry on to close the cycle on the knowledge cycle on a lot of this. So in my view, it's also one of the major handicaps about research in indigenous knowledge is basically in terms of the funding that is available compared to the funds that go to the study of the ecological study of biodiversity. There's a lot more resources allowed or made available for that kind of research, but very few for indigenous knowledge. I hope that with the promotion of the usefulness of the knowledge, the body of knowledge, that maybe things like funding for research and scholarship can certainly be better than what it is. I say, and this is the last point, that my experience here is that there's really a growing interest in the study of indigenous knowledge, maybe because of the threat that some of it are quickly eroding, but that's the the system as it is today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Veteyaki. I think both of your Professor Ratu and Professor Veteyaki's answers have addressed a lot of on questions on involvement of traditional knowledge. I think that also addresses the need for finances, and there's also a very good question from Yolani on how to process or how to include the history and all this knowledge of tribes and clans. The example from Papua New Guinea in building resilience of communities. I think you have highlighted some of those processes. For the interest of time, we have very good discussions and questions that are aligned there. Unfortunately, we do not have all the time to discuss this, but I'm now calling, I think it's good to take the conversation offline as well and continue, because there is a very strong interest from people who doing research on the field. And we welcome you guys to send emails to the members of the POCCA and the panelists now. And Pacific Island Forum Secretariat team will share some of these questions, and we can continue the conversation, because this is very important. And I think for now, Associate Professor Jemima, are you there? To share some thoughts on the role of academia on Pacific Resilience Partnership?
Okay, thank you, Vili, for this opportunity, and good afternoon, everybody. As summoned by Vili, I got to give a brief statement on the roles and the importance of research and academia in the Pacific Resilience Partnership platform. And I think all the panelists, they are professors in their own right that have actually explained and shared, the experiences, their research, of their expertise, in those areas. And I think PRP needs, their expertise in this area and in their own fields. The roles, there are actually 15 constituents that represented by the regional organization, the civic society, private sectors, and other countries in the PRP task force. And this actually includes the academia constituents. And our main role to pursue the 3 goals of the framework for resilient development in the Pacific, and that is the FRDP. And the 3 goals for the FRDP are to strengthen integrated adaptation and risk reduction to enhance resilience to climate change and disaster. The second one is the low carbon development, and the third one is strengthen disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. For the last 2 years, we have the academia constituent of the PRP has been trying to establish an active academic constituent group to support the PRP in its research needs and also capacity building in those 3 goals. Unfortunately, we were quite weak in that area, and I'm so glad that this POCCA seminar has given us a great opportunity to reach out to academia and to all researchers that are out there in the region, or those who are listening to us. So, so those of you who are listening to us, all academics, please email us, write to Viliamu in his email, and also even to me, jemima.lako@fnu.ac.fj. If you want to be part of this active academic constituent network, so that we can contribute, to the resilient capacity of our Pacific region, and also, as you've heard, from our panelists, also contribute to the IPCC report. As you have heard, that has been weak contribution, from the Pacific Voices. So this is an opportunity for us to work with with the POCCA to see how we can actually strengthen, our constituent and also work together. Also, to other constituents who are also tuning in, please send us an email if there's any research need, in your area, in community. And I think it will be really, really great, if there's funding that accompanies those requests, it would be really easy, for academics, to fulfill some of those research work that will be required, by a community. That's all, really. If you want to add on, you can actually add on from what I have shared.
Thank you very much, Associate Professor Lako. I don't need to add anything on top of what you have shared. You have done perfectly well. And thank you very much as well for sharing the contacts of the team there. I see Professor Hayward, your hand is up. Over to you now.
Apologies, I won't interrupt now. I was only going to respond to an issue about the new knowledge that's coming into these reports around community, Indigenous knowledge, history, anthropology. It's an exciting time, and so it's exciting to be supporting this research. And thanks for everyone's interest.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Hayward. Professor Holland, any final words?
I'm really enlivened, actually, to see the tremendous interest that there is in the POCCA. I really think that it's going to be a great opportunity and a great partnership between the POCCA and the PRP. And I'm just remembering Sharon Tohaime, who's just reminded us to look for the PRP, was among our first generation of students who was helping us begin to draft our first ideas about what a climate assessment for the Pacific might look like. So we started this as a class project, and I want to acknowledge the tremendous contributions that our students have made to the evolution of the idea of the POCCA over the many years. It's just been a tremendous honor and pleasure. And the partnership with the University of Canterbury is just a treasure.
Okay.
So, and many, many thanks to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their insight in their vision and supporting our vision.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Holland. Professor Vetayaki, any final thoughts?
Vivek.
Professor Vetayaki, any final thoughts? Okay, I'm sure Professor Vetayaki is probably praying for the Drewers next game now. Professor Ratova, over to you. Any final thoughts?
Oh yeah, I noticed that Professor Vetayaki had been having personal conversations outside, so we could hear him. Yeah, thanks so much. It's the last word. Well, in a way, I was kind of, well, I'm not saying I'm happy, but because I have a list of, in case somebody had asked, what kind of themes are you covering? I have a whole list of them, about 15 of them. So I have no time to go through them. So certainly it's something that we can continue discussions on when we hope to provide PRP with a list of themes, and then they will look at it, and we'll also share with a lot of you who are here today and other regional organizations and research institutions and those who are interested. And then hopefully things will begin to evolve. We want to get as much as possible in terms of people's views, people's sentiments as to where things should be heading in terms of our themes. We've been discussing the general structure of the research today in terms of what we're looking at, but the more specific aspects we'll share with you at a later stage as the time goes on. The next few weeks won't be long. Thank you so much, really, for chairing this interesting session. Thank you so much, our friends and our colleagues, relatives who I can see so many of them from around the region. Thank you so much for listening in.
Yep, thank you very much, Professor Ratova. Yep, and we also want to acknowledge the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, New Zealand, for supporting the POCCA. And I think, and also thanks to the coordinators of the Pacific Resilience Partnership, Tia and her team from the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and Anais and her team from the Pacific community. And we'd like to thank all of you. Again, it's been a really great discussion, and I see on the chats it's still rolling. So we will continue the momentum offline. I think you continue to send us emails, and then we will work on that for two reasons. One is we will work to support the overlap between the POCCA and the Pacific Resilience Partnership. And then the second one was the call from Associate Professor Lako, calling for the academia to step up and provide the support for the Pacific Resilience Partnership. Professor Ratuva?
Oh, sorry, I forgot. Just 1 second. Forgot to mention that we are also involved in a number of publications. The first issue of Pacific Dynamics on climate crisis is out. You can log in. If you have any material that you want published, we'll go through them and have it published. So it's going to be an ongoing process. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Ratuva. Yeah, and also thank you to our family members from the Pacific region, and also from our family members who joined from outside the Pacific Island region. We are all members of the same family, and we're looking forward to working more with you all in the coming days, months, and years. And we are stronger together. Thank you very much. And that's it for today. Vinava Levu and Faftai Lava.